British Prime Minister has described the terror attack in London as not just an attack on the UK, but an attack on the free world. 7 people were killed, 48 injured when 3 men drove into pedestrians on London Bridge, then began stabbing people in pubs and restaurants. Police say they know the identities of the 3 men. They also carried out more raids and detained more people today. Details have also been released of one of the victims, Christine Archibald from Canada, visiting for the first time with her fiancé. And later today, a vigil will be held in the capital. Well, the Prime Minister, the Police Commissioner, the London Mayor have all been reflecting on issues ranging from the police budget, Islam and the bravery of those who intervened. Eyewitnesses have also been giving harrowing accounts.
Well, the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police has said that the Met is well resourced, and they are, and that they have very powerful counter-terrorism capabilities, and they do. We have protected counter-terrorism policing budgets. We have also provided funding for an increase in the number of armed police officers. Since 2015, we have protected overall police budgets, and that's despite the fact that Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party in the House of Commons suggested that police budgets could be cut. But it's also about the powers that we give to the police. We've given increased powers to the police to be able to deal with terrorists, powers which Jeremy Corbyn has boasted he has always opposed.
We do have very extensive legislation. We do have very extensive powers. We need to look at whether we're using them to their full extent, and we'll be working with whoever is in the government to see whether further powers would assist. As for resourcing, every leader is going to ask for more resources. Of course they are. We do have a very, very powerful counter-terrorist effort, but as I've indicated, the threat seems to be changing. So we need to look at our strategy, we need to look at our resourcing, we need to look at the techniques we're using. We've always been able to sort of step up our game, and that, I'm afraid, is what we clearly need to do now.
The acts of these 3 men on Saturday night was cowardly, was evil. And I'm angry and furious that these 3 men are seeking to justify their actions by using the faith that I belong to justify their actions. The ideology they follow is perverse, it is poisonous, and it has no place in Islam. And I condemn this terrorist act, but also the poisonous ideology these men and others follow.
Bottles, glasses, a table. He tried to throw a bike at them because he saw these cowardly people stabbing that young woman and he wanted to do his bit. He put our lives before his. I can't believe he did it, and we are so thankful to him.
Well, let's talk about this for the next few minutes with Sasha Havlicek, CEO of the Institute for Strategic Dialogue. Also here is Margaret Gilmore, a Senior Associate Fellow at the Defence and Security think tank RUSI, and Usama Hassan, a Senior Researcher and Head of Islamic Studies at the Quilliam Foundation here in the Global Studios. Welcome, all of you. Sasha, to you, first of all, a simple question, hardest question. How do you combat this?
$1 million question. We need a comprehensive approach that combines the efforts of government with civil society and with the private sector. It's right what Theresa May said about ideology. We need to be looking at the hearts and minds piece of this, but of course government is ill-placed to do that alone. It lacks the credibility. We need a community-driven response. But for now, community-driven responses are small-scale, under-resourced, unstrategic for the most part. We need an upscaling and upskilling of those responses, and that requires us to think strategically, combining the efforts of the tech industry, of the private sector. We've been doing a lot of work with them in order to upscale the initiatives of civil society, of credible voices at the front line of this issue. We need networks of civil society playing a role, not just the usual old suspects, youth at the forefront of this, which is ultimately a youth challenge.
Well, you pose so many of the lines that we'll pursue in this conversation. But Margaret, first of all, in terms of the investigations, the attacks, 3 attacks in 3 months, how alarmed are the authorities, and what are the basic questions they will be asking of themselves?
They won't be surprised because they know this threat is there, and they will have no doubt the second it happened that the type of profile that we're going to see is going to be one of a group of people who are influenced by somebody else's ideology. They may not be, you know, that bright and understanding of it themselves. Influenced by peer pressure, probably have a little bit of dabbling in a criminal past, and have something in their minds and brains which tips them over and makes them different from you and me, and able to be violent, able to stab somebody. And so what will they be saying they could have done differently? First of all, they've got to get hold of anyone else who might be part of their network. So the concentration right now is finding out who they knew, who they're mixing with, is anyone else a threat? The time will come quite quickly when a group of people at MI5, MI6 will start looking at, are there lessons to be learned? These people have been on their radar. What were the signs that they missed? Why are they still missing the signs if they have actually been on the radar, which I suspect they will have been? But I do also agree with Sasha that although it's strategic and there's an awful lot of different things, I think we've got to get to this thing about how do you spot that psyche, that type of person who is going to flip out of the 3,000, out of the 20,000. And I think a lot of it is to do with families and communities, because where I have come across people who have been terrorists in the past, you will find they very often will say, it was my mother, it was my father, it was my brother or sister or my community, which convinced me ultimately it was wrong and I changed.
And Osama, that's exactly the sort of work you do now. But before I get to some of that, I mean, the Prime Minister, going back to what Sasha was saying, what we heard from her, saying enough is enough, but then saying there is too much tolerance of extremism in our country. Is she right about that? Who is tolerating extremism?
She's right that there has been a naivety around extremism. So, for example, extremist Islamist groups have been operating in this country for the last 30 to 40 years and have built up networks over that time. I mean, I myself, as a young man, was, part of these networks, so I know that well. And at Quilliam, many of us went through that phase, and we know these groups from the inside. And too much in wider society, there's been a naivety to say, let's not challenge that problem because it's Islamophobic or racist. No, it's not. To challenge this problem is to actually rescue Islam and Muslims from being tainted by this abhorrent stuff, and to enable us to contribute as equal citizens.
You talked about your own personal journey. As a youngster, you were radicalised yourself. You're open about that. Tell me how that actually happened.
Well, it's a mixture of internal and external factors. So facing racism, which was a weekly or daily occurrence growing up in 70s or 80s Britain, that was a huge push factor which led you to marginalisation. But then there's extremist ideology, charismatic recruiters, who pick up on that and say this is a global war between believers and non-believers, Muslims and non-Muslims, and you are a soldier, a holy warrior in this battle. Now, it's a very similar message now.
Impressionable, angry, naive, all of those things?
All of those things, but also devout, which I still try to be a devout Muslim. And that's why Muslim communities especially have to deal with the Islamist problem. We have neo-Nazi far-right terrorism and extremism as well in Europe, and other communities have to deal with that. But what Sasha was saying about communities is absolutely spot on. There are in fact hundreds of Muslims, including dozens of imams and mosques, who work with Prevent, but most of them are too afraid to say so openly because of intimidation by extremist groups who have lied about the Prevent programme, saying it's spying on Muslims, it's a war on Islam, which is not. And that has to change.
And in 2 out of the 3 most recent cases, of course, these people were referred from within the community, by Muslims within their community, to law enforcement. And so
that's a failure, isn't it? That is a failure and a frustration for the Muslim community that quite often hear after events like this, you should be doing more.
It may not be a failure. I mean, you can't just because somebody phones up. If I phoned up and said, Matthew here is extremist and showing dodgy signs of wanting to be a terrorist because I had a grudge against you, you can't just automatically put you under full-time surveillance because the law of this land says there has to be real, proper evidence before we can do that. That's what a democracy is.
But the warnings here, we won't get into a debate about the warnings here were pretty clear. And you heard Cressida Dick, the Commissioner, saying this morning openly, yes, we could do with more resources. I mean, is there a gap? But there is the figure of what, in excess of 21,000 people potentially who need to be monitored. Is there a gap in just the resources that would allow headway in terms of all of that?
These are really big debates because however awful and tragic what happened on 2 nights ago was, there are more people dying because they can't get the health facilities that they need in this country. There's certainly more people dying on the roads. But we've, as a society, got to make really big decisions about how much more we want to spend on counter-terrorism. The other thing is that you can't just overnight take on a whole load more people because you have to train them, you have to vet them, and it takes up to 9 months to vet somebody. As far as the police go, having said that, if the most powerful police officer in the land, Cressida Dick, says, actually, I think I do need more resources on this, and she's new in the job, then I would be listening very, very hard to her.
But that's just downstream. I mean, and there will be questions around the risk assessment framework, but there's an enormous amount of work to be done, and actually, comparatively, very little money spent on, if you like, the soft power piece of this challenge, which is addressing and engaging individuals who are on a pathway to radicalisation. We do a lot of work in outreaching to those individuals, both online and offline, often with former extremists at the forefront of that, networks of former extremists who are very effective at engaging with those individuals. But it is really important to remember the pull factor that Osama was talking about. It's not just push factors, it's pull factors.
The strategy, though, has almost been unchanged since 7/7. What changes do you think need to actually happen, given that the threat now is greater?
There needs to be a much more comprehensive, sustained support to civic leadership in the prevention space. And there has been a lot of investment, of course, but it's willy-nilly, it's a little bit fragmented, it's on and off.
It's what I hear. So when I come across police officers who are working really hard and effectively, they will say to you, you know, this council is really, we've got teams of people, and we've got the social workers, the probation officers, we've got the teachers working with us, and we are identifying people who will be noticed not by us, but then brought to our attention, and then suddenly they do something criminal and we can get on the case and go to the family. But some councils are not spending that type of money. So it's almost like a postcode lottery. I don't know whether you find this.
Well, there's something missing there, which again is the community aspect of that. And I think in the future this will be community-led. That's the only option going forward, really. A great engagement by communities openly to say we wish to do this for our own communities and for wider Britain as a whole. As I said, the extremist groups have tried to stop people from, Muslims especially, from taking part in counter-terrorism, counter-extremism efforts. And now it's time to put them on the back foot and say, look,
that's got to be challenged. And Sasha, you were talking earlier about, and the Prime Minister talked about the safe space on the internet. What more can be done there? Because it's possibly much easier to say than introduce new restrictions and then police them.
Well, there's both the regulatory side of that challenge, which is about terrorist content online and doing more to remove egregious content, and there's been recent commitments made by the internet companies that they would apply technological solutions to that problem, because that's very important in a way. Again,
it's possible?
Well, I think more can be done. They've agreed to establish an industry-led forum that would look at both technological solutions, but we have to remember that that will never, the regulatory side of this will never be the whole answer to this. We need to upskill the response side of it, so compete effectively online. And that, the internet companies, we've been working with them, they've been doing quite a lot to try and mobilise, both to educate people about how the internet radicalises, how to use the internet better to respond, and to support counter-speech, you know, led by community voices.
Quick final thought, just a phrase each from all of you. How long do you think this struggle lies in front of us?
Sadly, a generation or so. With ISIS being defeated, the ideas still remain, and those need to be eradicated in terms of making people at peace with the modern world. The terrorists reject the modern world, nation-state, democracy, all the rest of it, and in their devotion and fanaticism, they think as believers they cannot live in the real world. We have to convince them that it's quite possible to be a good believer, a devout Muslim in the modern world without hating your fellow citizens.
And that's the generational things, what I hear from the intelligence agencies. I remember a couple of years ago talking to somebody who said, somebody was saying, well, look, you know, ISIS are now going to be pushed out of Iraq and Syria, which they are being, and they said, be careful what you wish for, because ISIS will be sending home fighters. It will be pushing, therefore, for successes elsewhere, mainly in Europe. And I think that's what we're seeing now, where they want to be seen somewhere to be successful because they see that as a way of recruiting.
Sasha, just a quick final word. You talked about, and Margaret too, about the piecemeal approach. As it stands now, with this approach, is this winnable?
I don't think it's winnable unless we all come together. Companies, governments, civil society. Each generation has its fascistoid, totalitarian ideologies to combat. It is a sort of civic duty for each generation to keep our societies open, and it will be a generational struggle.
Well, we have simply run out of time, but to all three of you, thank you so much for coming in and discussing the many, many issues raised from all of this. Thank you.